now.
Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we have David Zahl on. We're going to be talking about his new book, Low Anthropology, The Unlikely Key to Gracious View of Others and Yourself, published by Brazos Press. And we're going to be talking to him here in a moment and asking him some questions about this new book of his. If you go to our show notes, we have some resources for you guys. You can check out the link to Brazos Press and some resources of how to get a hold of us, how to reach us, and other resources, how to find a confessional Reformed churches near your area, and the like. So we also have a little bit, I kind of wanted to do something a little different and read one of the endorsements that David Zahl has here on the Low Anthropology book. One is from, I'll just pick a random one. How about Mike Cosper? He said about David's book, I know of a few people better equipped to cut through the religious noise of our day than David Zahl, and this book is no exception. While we're constantly being told to think better and expect more of ourselves, Zahl provides a counterintuitive take. He shows us that there's goodness in being merely human, and there's great humor to be found in it too. So I'll let Peter further introduce David Zahl today.
Yeah, we have David Zahl coming on our show today, and he's done a couple things, but one of those is founder and director of Mockingbird Ministries, which receives more than 1 million website page views per year and has 35,000 newsletter subscribers and social media followers. He also is an editor-in-chief of the Mockingbird blog and co-host of the Mockingcast podcast. He wrote the critically acclaimed book, which got me interested in this book, actually, The Seculosity, How Career, Parenting, Technology, Food, Politics, and Romance become our new religion, What to Do About It. It was written for Christianity Today, Washington Post, lives with his wife and 3 boys in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he also serves on the staff of Christ Episcopal Church. It's a pleasure having you on our show.
Thanks for having me, guys. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to ask you first, before I ask any of my actual questions, this is not on the thing that we sent. What was it like meeting Bono?
Well, it was very short. I was at a big event in Washington, and he was there speaking, and sort of a friend of the family ushered us backstage. They knew that I was a fan, a bit of a super fan.
Mm-hmm.
And he had his sunglasses on. You know, we were indoors.
Of course.
I'm looking at a photo right now. It looks like total Bono right next to you.
Yeah, and he was delightful. He was interested and interesting, and he was small. You know, he's not a tall guy.
Mm-hmm.
But I got no I got no kind of like artifice from him, even though he was, glad handing a lot of people. So we didn't get to talk much. He asked me my name and what I was doing there, and I was like, I don't really even know what I'm doing here, but I'm glad I'm here to meet you.
Yeah.
And it was a funny event because I was right next to, like, I think Tony Campolo was in the room.
Oh my gosh,
with me.
yeah.
But then also, I mean, frankly, Barack Obama was right across the room before he was president, and it was
where on earth was this?
This was at the National Prayer Breakfast, which is an event in DC that is it gets televised every year. It's
okay.
It's I don't even know how to describe it, except for it's kind of like an ecumenical gathering of people in Washington interested in faith, and it's sort of Jesus is at the center, but there's no denominational affiliation. It's at a huge hotel, and the president usually speaks. And there's a lot of politicians, and that year they had Bono speak. I don't know who had the connection, but I was like,
so random.
My in-laws knew someone who was sort of helping organize, and they said, I think we got to do this for you. So like that's all of a sudden I got pulled into a room and was like, whoa, who am I talking to again?
That's hilarious. Yeah. I was looking through the Mockingbird website, and I was like, I saw a photo. I was like, oh my gosh, you met Bono. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, but probably the most famous person I've ever gotten to shake hands of.
Huh. That's cool. Yeah. Well, actually, let's go to my actual first question. But so those who are on here not here to learn about Bono, but they're here to learn about you and the book that you wrote. But maybe if you can tell listeners a little bit about yourself, your work, and what you do.
Sure. Well, I run Mockingbird, which is at this point, the way I describe it to people, it's a platform. I mean, that's what's become. That's what the publishing industry considers it. That's what ministry leaders consider it. That's what people in the church think of it as. So it's a platform, and by that I mean a media platform. So we have a website, social media, conferences. We have a print magazine. We have lots of podcasts, and our whole focus is really on integrating the grace of God with everyday life. So you might think of it as like a creative project of like retrieval almost that we want to emphasize the same things you guys emphasize, to be honest with you. Guilt, grace, and gratitude is the center of the Christian faith. And do that in just sort of unexpected ways. We were confessionally or theologically, we're mostly we're Protestants of the kind of Anglican Episcopal realm, which is it's confusing for people because global Anglicanism is a very different thing than the Episcopal Church, which is a different thing than Anglicanism here now. So there's a lot of infighting, like any denominational context, but there is in fact also a long reformational basis to when you look at Thomas Cranmer, who wrote our prayer book, and you look at he was influenced primarily by Martin Luther, and so the language of the prayer book is deeply rooted in those distinctions. And for us, like I could go further. I could talk about Robert Capon being a kind of a guiding light. My father, Paul Zahl, was a theological influence. There's some Lutherans that we love, like Gerhard Ferde, who are kind of on the more radical end of that world. But Mockingbird itself, the distinction between the law and the gospel, for example, is pretty foundational to who we are. Theology of the cross versus theology of glory.
Oh yeah.
And we were coming out of a context where those distinctions had either been lost or never even really talked about. And yet the people who started Mockingbird, and we've been around for 15 years. It was we found these things to be inspiring, exciting, generative, creative, and all sorts of pastorally trenchant. But completely unsung for a variety of kind of mostly combination of sort of academic fashionability and political misunderstandings, I think. And so we decided to trumpet that, but do it in a way that was sort of slightly outside of ecclesial boundaries, because those have been so painful.
Those distinctives, they kind of speak to they're big. The school that I went to, Westminster, California, they're big distinctives. At our school, we're called "quote unquote" Lutheran, as if it's a bad thing. We're like, those are great things to be called. Are you kidding me? I would love to be called that stuff. But that's thanks for doing what you do.
Thank you. I mean, we're sort of operating in a more mainline context, but like the White Horse Inn that comes out of Westminster was formative for me, and the ministries of Michael Horton and Rod Rosenblatt, especially, were great inspirations, especially when we were trying to find our footing as young men and women, trying to talk about God's grace.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Yeah. So coming to this book, or actually coming to your last book, Seculosity. What was the background? So Seculosity was written 3 or so years ago. What was the background? Because it shares some context with low anthropology. So what was the background for low anthropology coming off the heels from Seculosity?
Yeah, so Seculosity was kind of born out of really 12 or so years of writing for Mockingbird on the web, and looking at the cultural conditions that we were surrounded by, and especially anxieties surrounding righteousness and cultural righteousness. I was primarily interested in sort of how how does our notions of righteousness, how have they been secularized and in some senses amplified, um, and also uh, sucked dry of any kind of mercy. So replacement religion is how that actually is how that functions in the world. And so I was noticing a tremendous amount of anxiety around people feeling like they're not enough, or that they were looking to all sorts of everyday categories to provide them with almost an absolution or a righteousness. And that was not being given religious significance, but that's how it was functioning. And especially as someone who was coming out of a religious point of view could say, oh my gosh, well, this is the dynamics. Like I know about legalism. I know about the endless treadmill of trying to achieve justification by works of the law. And that's what it feels like to be shopping in Whole Foods today, and that's what it feels like to be working out at CrossFit. And that's what it feels like to, engage in the political discourse. And that's what it feels like to pursue a career when you can never stop grinding in the hustle economy. So I thought I had some resources to marshal, and some I wanted to do it in winsome way, and in a way that was based on just sort of observing the culture and myself for years. And I found it struck a real note, I mean, in people's lives. And partly it almost has become a trope, to be honest with you, Peter, in the years since. I mean, it's only been three and a half years since that book came out, but everyone said, oh, that's a religion. Oh, that's your new religion, and stuff like that. And it can be a way to just dismiss anything you don't like. But I think also there's an increasing acknowledgement that our sort of existential mooring as a society has to go somewhere. And the way that we harness, the way that those religious impulses play out and wreak havoc in our lives, when we sort of maintain all of the demanding parts of our faith and none of the absolving or forgiving or merciful, none of the gospel, none of the grace, that creates the fallout, that spiritual, psychological, relational, even collective, political, that is really damaging. So now all that to say is, like, what really that book is doing is translating the doctrine of justification by faith into contemporary language. That's what I was really doing. And I say that in the Q&A in the back of the paperback. And I make no bones about it. I mean, I say that these are the same dynamics that Paul was talking about, and Augustine was talking about, and Luther was talking about, and of course Jesus was talking about. But justification by grace, or by faith, by grace through faith, that, and justification by works of the law, like, I found that dichotomy, that to be fairly descriptive of what it was like to be a person in the world in 2019. And so I wanted to breathe new, and yet Christians, especially in my context, were very uncomfortable. Like, people would say, oh, those are antiquated notions of, like, people aren't anxious today about, like, the anger of a righteous God, that they were dismissed as irrelevant or indifferent to. And that just was completely untrue in my personal experience.
Totally.
That I was surrounded by people, including myself, who were chasing some sense of righteousness according to usually some arbitrary set of law, but equally crushing. And for whom I thought that if you wanted to communicate the gospel, we had an amazing opening to do so. And so that book is trying to do that. It's trying to say, well, this is why justification by faith is so exciting and urgent and necessary. So low anthropology, I know it's a long answer to a short question, but the low anthropology is an attempt to do the same thing, but with the kind of a Christian, sort of the dual sense of creatureliness and original sin. So to look at how those Christian truths can be translated into modern parlance in such a way as to highlight their true profundity and the way that they lead us to faith and to a more generous view of ourselves and other people, not a kind of a weaponized, shame-inducing kind of thing that which they've been caricatured as. So I thought Low Anthropology, as I went around and spoke also about seculosity, because it did receive quite an enthusiastic reception. I noticed, about seculosity, I noticed that Low Anthropology and the way that I was talking about human nature was really resonating with people.
Yeah.
And in a good way, not in a and across divides, across demographical divides, across ecclesiastical divides, and across sort of like theological divides. So I thought, well, how can I write a kind of a winsome introduction that is really geared toward anyone? It's ultimately an argument for an emotionally intelligible argument for faith in God.
Yeah.
And God is the great force for goodness, but it has to start sort of further back than where a Christian would start. And so that was what I was interested in doing.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's not I think in the best possible, it's not an explicitly Christian book. Like you wouldn't go into reading it and see your religious arguments for quote unquote a lower view of humanity, whatever people might call it. But you kind of get quote unquote more religious towards the end, like more biblical arguments, more original sin arguments, which we sign on to wholeheartedly. But like you do start with more like, how do we just interact with our world? What does our world expect of us? How does our world tell us to view other humans? And then you get into some of the more original sin arguments, to confessional arguments, the law gospel arguments, which I appreciated that because it's an easier on ramp for those who are not Christians, who are like, how do I view other people? How do I view myself?
Well, thank you. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I'm in ministry. I have plenty of books that are geared towards rehabilitating doubting Christians or people who've fallen prey to legalism. And I have lots of wonderful works of theology that I can give folks. What I don't have is a book I can give to my neighbor who isn't interested in church but is deeply depressed and wants some hope, and is going about it in a way that is probably preventing that, and in a way that's not immediately condemnatory or uses jargon. And so I appreciate that. I want it to be a book you feel you can buy and give to other people. I want it to be, but I also hope I didn't write myself out of an audience, because one thing I've heard is that it's a little too Christian for non-Christians and it's a little too secular for Christians. And I don't think that's actually true. The people that understand what I'm doing, I've heard from lots of sort of just random folks who've read it who didn't think they were interested in religion or God, who found it deeply compelling and say, "Hey, can I come to church sometime?" And I've heard from people who have who are in the church and have found it to be really encouraging and a useful tool, but also something that kind of has helped them understand their own anthropological assumptions.
Yeah. I was gonna say this. Yeah, I did the same for me.
Yeah, that kind of tees into and ties into my first question pretty well, actually. And I think what you're saying too, you're taking a what we call bridging the gap. You're really making this accessible. There's for introducing biblical themes and doctrines to your neighbor that might not be a believer, and obviously we're not going to give them a
bondage of the will from Martin Luther and say, hey,
exactly.
Man, figure it out.
Thump them over the head with that. This is a good gateway into explaining something. There's two words that kind of pop out with your seculosity book and Low Anthropology book to me is practical. They're both very practical, which is, you can read it and hit the ground running, and it talks about your everyday life and how to utilize it. And then also refreshing. It's just,
thank you.
I think those are two appropriate words, and that I would take away. I don't know if both of you would agree with those terms or not. You've both have read more of the books than I have. They're both on my the seculosity book's on my must read list, and I'm currently going through low anthropology. But with that said, I think some people will see this book and beautiful artwork on the front. It's almost kind of like a
Yeah, it is
comic
gorgeous.
book
Yeah, I
theme.
like it.
Any comic book nerds out there will probably kind of see it and be like, "Oh, that's pretty cool."
And I
Like,
liked your Brazos ad that I saw on Amazon too, of you actually doing
Yeah,
that yourself.
I had to fight for the slanted text because that was sort of seemed a little non-serious, but I'm like, I'm writing about some very, very serious things. And if that is if we have a dark cover, no one's gonna pick it up, you know. So I was like, I wanted something to capture the tone of the book that
Yeah.
is playful
I think you did. Yeah.
and refreshing. Refreshing is the word that I think is I like covers that are refreshing, like
Yes.
visually refreshing. And this is the cover has a guy who's yanking a tablecloth out from a set table, and he's doing it poorly. He's not doing it right. He's doing it in a way that everything goes flying
Yep.
except for one thing, which
Huh.
is a lily. And that in my tradition is what Easter we have on Easter. So that is
Okay.
a people never having gotten that reference that much, but that's what that is. That's God
I
remains.
wondered, yeah.
The
I
book is about
wondered like what was the significance, and now it just made sense now.
yeah, the revealing that what's going on underneath, but in a way that is going to get it wrong because of human fallibility, but is also not taking itself that seriously, and yet leaves something very, very beautiful and true and good on the table, which is, for me, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's what that cover is actually trying to communicate. And it's also I always love visual depictions of donuts. So there's one of those.
That's right.
Very
Yeah,
nice.
There's an apple with a bite out of it, which is, ha ha ha. That's not unintentional.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So yeah, the kind of the first question I have would be, some people read what does a low anthropology even mean? What, is it is it the opposite of high anthropology? Could you give it kind of a brief definition of what that means?
Because I had this wrong. I thought it was going to be one thing coming into the book, and it was a completely different thing when I read
What did
the
you
book.
think it was going to be?
I thought it was
Peter?
like it's a bad thing to have low anthropology. Like,
Oh,
we have too low of a view, and we have to have a high view. And then you flipped it upside down. I was like, oh, I was completely wrong when I walked into this book.
Well, good. That sounds like that makes it interesting, right?
It did, yeah.
So I say that everyone's got an anthropology it's not I'm not using it like a cultural anthropology, which is sort of the study of how like human communities work, and people in, on the coast of I don't know, Brazil are trying to get along in the rainforest or something. I'm talking about the way that theologians and philosophers use that term, which is simply your operating view of human nature. So everyone's got an anthropology. Everyone has something that they mean when they say I'm only human, which I guess even Tom Brady said the other day, which is kind of remarkable. But and he said it, of course, in reference to his divorce and a sort of a sense of failure. And that's what it means to be human. Anyway, we all, even if we don't have something that's consciously constructed, I don't think there's a human person on the face of the earth who doesn't have some sense of what human beings are good at or not good at or capable of or incapable of, or what kind of principles govern our behavior. That's your anthropology. So and everyone's got one, and I charted on high to low, and it's not necessarily, it's not directly correlated to sort of human beings are basically good versus human beings are basically bad. What I think a high anthropology is what says that the most true thing about or if you want to know what binds the human race together, it's our greatest achievements, our potential, and our sort of our I don't know, our moral capacity. And a high anthropology basically sees people, it's an optimistic, that's maybe a better way to say it, an optimistic view of human nature.
Things can get better. You can get better if you just try harder, and let's all kind of go for this common purpose together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a high anthropology, and it sounds kind of nice when you're trying to inspire, your sixth grader. But when you're, in your 40s and you think, wow, well, what does it mean for me if I haven't really, it hasn't panned out the way I thought it would, and I've proven to be resistant to my best interests, and I have often even sometimes been complicit in my own misery. Like what does that mean? So a low anthropology is a more sober view of human nature that takes into account that we are limited, that we are conflicted or doubled, as I call it, and that we are, in fact, we all deal with a kind of an ineluctable dark side of self-centeredness, and which Christians call sin. And so it says low anthropology is kind of a is a blanket term for a view of human nature that allows us to be honest, and is rooted, though, in weakness, limitation, and says that if you really want to get to know another person, if you really want to, in fact, love another person, you need to know about the stuff they leave off their resume. You need to know about you need to figure out who they really are, as opposed to what's going to bind us together is going to be our fallibilities rather than our capabilities. So, and I think it's demonstrably true. I think it's really misunderstood. It's in a deep irony. I think a view of human, like a high anthropology, sounds nice, but turns out to be embittering and oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And a low anthropology sounds insulting, but turns out to
Yeah.
be profoundly inspiring and sustaining, and generative of love.
I'm just pure curiosity. I didn't see this in your book. Have you ever read Camille Paglia?
Yeah, I
Okay.
definitely read Camille.
Okay, I was curious because I'm going through one of her books, right? I've read almost everything that she's written because I think she's an incredible writer. She's got some idiosyncratic views, which I'm sure you know of too.
I mean, have you ever read what she wrote about Star Wars, the third Star Wars movie?
I've not gotten to that yet. I think that's in the book that I'm in right now, because she's talking about art and society and all that stuff in this new book.
Yeah.
But she talks about original sin, and she's like, it's the worst idea that Christianity has ever had, is original sin, of how low a view of human nature it has. Because I've seen that in other books too. Kind of like Paglia, kind of not like her, but it was interesting reading her intent. This wasn't intentional on my part, but reading her in tandem with low anthropology is like, that's like it really is. Those who don't have this kind of worldview will see things very differently and expect progress and expect things to get better. And she points out, like the number one thing beyond Jesus, resurrection, is like the number one thing Christianity has done to hurt us is this doctrine of original sin. It's got too low a view of human nature.
That's interesting, because a lot of her writing is sort of based. I mean, she's got it because she has such a high estimation of art.
Yep.
I think she probably sees that in that. But there's lots and lots of secular writers who say, in fact, we've so disappeared up our we've so become intoxicated with our own importance that we've lost any sense of humility. And humility is actually the great virtue in that produces human greatness, in fact.
Yeah.
And that we, Silicon Valley is both exploits our all of our blind spots and our biases and our kind of dopamine desires, but at the same time has this view of human nature as sort of perfectible, that that crushes people. It just crushes everywhere I go. I see people struggling with the burden of perfectionism and feeling like they're the only ones who are barely hanging on or making it up as they go along. And I see that in Christian circles. I see it in non-Christian circles. And this sense that to me, as a person with a low anthropology, says, actually, the only reason you think everyone else has it together is you don't know them very well. Like, that's the only reason that you sit in church and you see that family over there. If only my marriage were more like that, if only my job was more like hers, if only my kids were like theirs. The only reason you think that, or the primary reason you think that, there are distinctions between people, and I accept that there are ways about going through life that are a little happier than other ways. But the main reason you think that about them is that you don't know them very well. And if you are in ministry, what you find out is behind closed doors, the people that you think, you have to go through it for many years, but the people that you think are crushing it or doing well, when you behind closed doors, they let loose the most heart-wrenching confessions and or afflictions that you've ever heard. So it's like you live a little bit, and you realize that, oh my gosh, maybe the truth about us is that we're all suffering, and that we're all, and not only that we're all suffering, we're not all just victims, we're also our own worst enemies. We're complicit in that suffering, and there's real I find that to be a groundswell of compassion and unity. I all of a sudden feel like I can love this other person, and I'm more like them than I realized. And that to me is a wonderful gift that the doctrine of original sin gives us. Ultimately, what the description of sin and sin and limitation and creatureliness does is not, it's not just a doctrine, it's the truth. I mean, it's just like it's empirically verifiable, as Chesterton always said, but or Niebuhr, I don't know who that's actually attributed to, but it is the gateway to faith. You know, it's I need help. I need help from you, and I need help from my family, and I need help from my friends, but I ultimately need more than help. I need deliverance, redemption from God. That's like a, and that's where hope is actually to be found. So this is not a defeating understanding of the world. In fact, it places the good where the good is actually be found.
Yeah, and real quick before Nick's next question, this is less of a meaty question, because it reminds me of a book Tim Keller, I think it's an ebook actually, maybe 10 years ago. It's The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. I forget how he published this or where he published this, but it's not, it reminds me of your book too. It's not like intentionally thinking lower of yourself, like, oh, like, whoa, like, woe is me and I'm lost, and which is true, but it's not like, it's not the intentional, like, I have to speak myself down or speak terribly about myself. But it seems more like thinking truly about yourself. It's no, I have these struggles, I have these fears, I have these sufferings, and I tend not to tell people what they are. And so people have a higher view of me, and I have a higher view of people because I don't know what their sufferings, what they're going through is. So it's not like you're trying to tell yourself like you suck and everything's terrible with you. It's no, it's like, this is actually who I am, is somebody who is broken.
I hope that's it. I mean, I had a friend who said, "Oh, Dave, did you just write 'You Suck' the book?" And I said, "No, I didn't. I mean, well, I did say, you know, it's like you're." I said you're human is the book I wrote, and therefore, any chance you have of being loved is going to have to take that into account. And these notions of being loved for our strengths and our accomplishments, it doesn't track with the data of our lives. Like, no one actually at the top of the mountain feels terribly loved. You know, you feel loved at the bottom of the mountain when you've fallen off the ladder and someone comes to you graciously in full view of your liabilities and your weaknesses. That's how love actually is experienced. And I just don't think, whatever a person thinks of the Bible, how can you argue with that? I just don't. I don't think it's I think it's found in the Bible. I think it's ultimately the Christian faith starts there in a lot of ways. You know, it doesn't mean much until you've failed, until you've sinned, until you've, you know, what need do you have of a savior? If you were why would Jesus be of all interesting to you if you can sort of do it on your own, or maybe with a little bit of help from God? Like, that there's plenty of schemes for you that to get better, but I don't think a religion of salvation is what you need, you know. So there's a bit of a let me say one other thing though, because it's not, this is because people always say, oh, what about Imago Dei? And this book does not deny the Imago Dei, that we're created in the image of God, and that nothing God creates is bad. that can be, I think, in scripture, there's very little space giving to the Imago Dei. Like it's a way to distinguish us from animals is really what it is. There's a lot more talk about brokenness and rebellion and sin. So I think that that's something that's very important to keep in mind. But it's again, two things to say. This does not. It's low anthropology is a comprehensive view of human nature. It says that I am both my greatest achievements and my worst failures. And it doesn't rule one out. Another thing low anthropology often always pushes back against is certainty, some sense of I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am the worst person that's ever lived. You don't know that. You are God. Only God has the full picture of any of us or the world. And I think that we're living in a world of high anthropology because we're living in a world of certainties where people think that they have access to the full truth about anything, and they don't. And humility says, I may know 99.9% of what there is to know about X, Y, or Z, including you, including myself, including a given situation that's causing me pain, but I don't know everything. And that means that there's always a way forward. There's space for curiosity. And so I find that low anthropology, it's not defeating or shame-inducing to say, I can't know it all, I can't do it all, I can't be it all. It's shame-inducing and defeating to say, I just haven't managed to do it yet. That's the thing that leaves a person completely alone and in years and years of not even feeling like they can turn to God because they should have the internal resources. That is a high anthropology. That is what causes that compounds our suffering. Whereas the low anthropology finds suffering as a gateway to reach out to the one who can actually do something about it, which is God.
Yeah, that's good. That tees up my question on irony, which you brought up earlier. But before I jump into that question, there's a few things that you guys while you were talking, it kind of reminded me of some notes I took on your book. There was a quote in there from Brené Brown. He said, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of love." I think that's a very profound.
Even though Brene Brown's books are the opposite of low anthropology. She's all about the high anthropology.
Well, they start from a place, the popularity of Brene Brown's work. And I just want to say this, her work it struck a deep, deep chord in a culture of perfectionism.
Yep.
And so one of the reasons I wrote the book was I saw, oh my gosh, people are resonating, especially women, but a lot of men too, are resonating with this buzzword of vulnerability. And what that really is saying is that people don't feel like they can tell the truth about themselves ever. Right. And they're flocking towards some kind of self-help or loosely academic view that says actually to be a human is to be full of doubt and not having it all together, and the ability to be open about that is the doorway to making it any kind of alleviating it in some way. So in some sense, Brene, she never wants to talk about the moral dimension of anything, because I can be vulnerable about my depression and tell you I'm a depressed person, and that's better than me pretending I'm not. I think generally speaking, to be completely hidden and have a double life and never talk about what you're really thinking about. I think the Christian faith invites us to do that, but I also have to acknowledge that my depression has a damaging effect on the people that depend on me and love me. And my wife has to pick up the pieces. My kids have to deal with a non-present father, and that's not just okay. I need more than just confession. I need absolution. I need reconciliation. I need forgiveness. And that's where, that's not her job. She's not a minister,
totally.
But I would say, thought to myself, gosh, there's so many of these books being written about, the beauty of imperfection and limitation being and which it's gosh, I was you think, oh my word, we're living in such a culture of high anthropology. People are dying for some permission to tell the truth. And what if we could do this in a way that also just takes it a couple steps further and doesn't leave people only with this sort of truth telling, but brings them to the foot of the cross.
Yeah, it gives them a solution to their
Yeah.
vulnerability. It says, yeah, say it, but like here's the answer. It doesn't make everything right now, but it at least shows you why you have all these pains and fears and anxieties.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but she's right about vulnerability being the birthplace of love. That's that's absolutely true.
Yep.
So yeah, there is a great irony with having low anthropology. So what is this irony? Can you go into a little bit more on why might this be the key to a freer view of ourselves and others versus like a higher anthropology?
Well, people think again, they think of low anthropology is synonymous with shame and a kind of a massive, you are the worst thing, and that in a Christian would say that that you're denying what God has pronounced good, and you're just clinging to this, again, because sin has been weaponized against people, and I almost don't like using that word because it sounds so fashionable, but what I mean by that is a high anthropology creeps into the church when it says you're a sinner, a miserable sinner. Now stop, stop being that.
Yeah.
And that's so that you're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. The Christian faith really says you are a sinner in need of redemption, and here is a savior who has died for you, like and risen for your justification, and that is what Christianity says. But a sort of a high anthropology, what sounds like low anthropology, but it's actually a high anthropology, says you are a miserable sinner, and that's all that's true about you. And now but at the same time, you somehow have it in the power within yourself to
Work harder.
work harder. And
Yeah.
like that kills people. That pits them against themselves, and that's terrible. And I'm trying to push back against that. But that's a lot of times I when people hear the word sin, they hear the somehow, oh, it's right for me to judge you for your inadequacies rather than have compassion for you. And that's not what sin simply names. The experience of ourselves and of the world as people who are not 100% free to do the right thing, and in fact often actively want to do the wrong thing. And I find that instead of being the irony, people think, oh, that sounds so negative, Dave, that sounds so hopeless. And I don't think that's in practice, that's not true at all. I mean, the irony is the most transformative communities you'll ever encounter. And by that, I mean AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, but I also mean the church at its best. These are communities that are transformative and other-centered and full of charity and grace for the world at its worst. The people doing the work in the darkest corners of society, they all begin with a kind of a low anthropology. They don't begin with a pull yourself up by your bootstraps or you're better than you think you are. I mean, I quote at the beginning Brian Stevenson, who's done all this work on behalf of inmates on death row, and you think, oh, is he doing this because he believes in the imago Dei and the dignity of every human being, and that people deserve more of a chance? And I'm sure in some sense he does, but when he's asked to account for how he keeps going, he says, I do it because I'm broken too. Like I see that I am unified. I'm just like these other men, even though my sin has taken a different form. That's where that's where understanding, empathy, and the desire to love and serve another person comes from. And that's ironic because we think that it's going to stop us in our tracks, and it doesn't. It doesn't. It never has, unless it's preached with the sort of again that sort of just stop it. But if you're at AA or if you're in the church, at least churches that I'm been a part of, they do confession and absolution every single week.
Yep.
By walking in those doors, you acknowledge that you are a sinner in need of God's grace, and you're going to receive it there. And that's a beautiful thing. And that is the starting point of any love for other people. That is, again, not to be, you don't sit there thinking, you leave thinking, I'm so terrible. You just leave thinking, I'm who I am, but I'm also, and I've confessed my sins, but I've also been absolved, and I can sort of go forth kind of looking at the needs of my neighbor, not myself. Like God's got it. And I think anyway, that's what I would say. That's ironic. People And for some reason, people can really get on board with that when you get into Alcoholics Anonymous and recovery groups. But the second you talk about the church in those terms, because there's more morality involved, they just want to run for the hills. But the same thing is true, is that we believe growth, love, service, charity, compassion, curiosity, courtesy, and sympathy begin with a honest and humble appraisal of ourselves, not a inflated kind of self-congratulatory one.
Yeah.
Mark 2:17 is so relevant to this.
What's Mark 2:17?
Yeah, Mark
It's not the
2:17.
righteous.
Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. So, I mean, our church is a spiritual hospital.
Yeah, I mean, amen to that. That's the again, Christianity doesn't make much sense in light of a high anthropology. It becomes like a partnership with God scheme, or it becomes entirely focused on rebuilding things out there rather than in here. And I just don't find that as profound, or as ultimately as it doesn't stand the test of time in the same way. The folks I know, and I also think it's like, you read the great testimony of the kind of the saints of the faith, or simply just your spiritual mentors or forebears, or people that you respect, and by the time they get to the end of their life, they're never saying, gosh, I've really climbed that ladder, I've really gotten a little closer to Jesus. They may say that I'm closer to Jesus, but I'm closer to Christ by knowing how much I need him. Like there's it's a journey into deeper dependence rather than away from dependence on God. And that is again another beautiful but counterintuitive thing about low anthropology. So low anthropology unburdens us of the need for certainty in ourselves. It's an invitation to friendship and collaboration, knowing that God has given everyone different gifts, but very similar weaknesses. And I can look to you to help me and to be a help to you, rather than someone to compete with or an obstacle to get over or under.
Yeah. So my last question before Nick's last question, and we talked about this a little bit before recording, and I just finished watching this show. And I can't think of the chapter off the top of my head, although I think it's in the middle. I connected for me on a pretty deep level. And you started this chapter with a Walt Whitman quote, be curious, not judgmental, and then succeeded by a scene in Ted Lasso. And I won't give away what happens in the scene if you guys haven't watched it yet, but it's a dartboard game with Rupert, and I'll let people fill in the details if they've seen this or haven't seen this yet. But in the way that he approaches this, and the chapter you talk about this as well, and this also relates pretty well to what you just said. How does this play out in our daily discourse, and not like saying, oh, okay, I know what this is, I can no longer deal with this because I've already kind of judged it, and this is what it is. Most usually with those we disagree with, I think, at some pretty fundamental levels. So how does low anthropology help us with those we disagree with? And not saying like, oh, you're this, and therefore I can label you and go from this and not worry about this any longer.
Yeah, well, a high anthropology categorizes people. It says there are people like this and people like that. And if only those people would sort of either be defeated or kind of get out of the way or simply silenced, then things would proceed in towards goodness and utopia. And low anthropology says, in fact, I'm much more like you, or I'm much more like that person I despise than I would care to admit. And that means that there's a bridge, that could be found. The bridge is not going to be found at the level of virtue. It's going to be found at the way that we both fall short of whatever our virtues are. And that if I really want to get to know you, I got to know where you struggle with, and that there's always a potential for that. So the us versus them, and Bono has the great quote, Peter. There is no them, there's only us. And what he's drawing on a low anthropology that says you and I are both prone to blind spots, what today are called biases, and sin and limitation, and that I actually have something to learn from you, even those I really virulently disagree with, and that you're not another species. Like again, a high anthropology has to say, if you're like that, if you think such a thing, you must either be evil or insane. And a low anthropology has to look for other reasons why a person might think that way. Well, maybe they grew up in a different context. Maybe they're seeing it from a different point of view, and I might not agree with it. I might, but I might, in fact, feel very strongly about opposing it. But I cannot view it to say that the person is simply one of those bad people is a high anthropology, because that is that again, that's breaks people down into categories. The other thing is when we're talking about curiosity, again, a limited human being, a creature rather than a creator, as we said, who's subject to simply their own context. Like you're a person who was born in a particular time and place, means that you do not have access to all of the truth about things. And I draw upon all sorts of things. It's like, we're so certain of things right now, and yet we look back at ourselves 20 years ago and we think, gosh, that person was such a he was so mistaken about these 6 things, and now I know the truth. And the low anthropology says there are also things about your current self that you will look back on in 20 years and say that same thing about. What is it about your current situation today that the way that people think about smoking cigarettes today, for example, like there's something about the way we are right now that our children will look back on the way we look back on the way we about smoking cigarettes, right? Some key piece of evidence that we are missing just by nature of being limited creatures. And so that doesn't mean you can't be fairly confident of your positions or your convictions about things, but it does mean you have to hold them slightly more gently, and possibly wait until it might prevent you from taking up a gun, because that's when certainties come into 100% watertight certainties. That is the language of kind of a fundamentalism that is a secular fundamentalism as well as religious fundamentalism, and it is not available to people with a low anthropology. That's the realm of God, not us. And that's just, Jesus is always take the log out of your own eye. It's the common ground is found in the fact that neither of us has access to the full truth. And so again, people hear that and they think you're flattening every kind of
that was gonna be my next follow-up is like, are you saying there's no right and wrong? And I think what you're saying is no, you just don't have the whole picture.
No, and I think that that's God's realm, and I think God has there's certain things we can draw from Scripture that, and everyone's going to disagree about what those are, but that we can sort of take on faith, and yet I still, even there, again, I just don't think we're living in a time, or that we've ever lived in a time where too much humility is the problem. Like I think, and that people need to be told, it's okay to have more stronger convictions. We're living in a time where people are told they have to be absolutely certain and expertly convicted about absolutely everything. So where do you stand on such and such? What's your position here? Have made a statement about X, Y, or Z? These are the questions. These are the default questions that we're forced to reckon with. And a low anthropology says, there's like 1 or 2 things that I'm fairly sure of, and that I really want to, the hill I want to die on or something like that, but not everything. And our issue today is I would be more concerned about sort of quote unquote relativism. That was a boogeyman. Like I think that evangelicals, people who grew up in a sort of a conservative Christian context, were told that relativism was the great problem, that the flattening of right and wrong, and that is not the problem, and that we were totally wrong about that. It's just a different form of right and wrong. That we are dealing with. We are not dealing with a time where people say anything is true, or no, there's very strong positions on what is true, and competing notions of righteousness that are oppressive and will kill you. So that is my answer always to that question. I want people to feel the courage of their convictions while also holding them with a little humility, because I think that I don't want to talk, and I'll just say this too, Peter, like social media amplifies these things. Technology makes us click on the things that get us more angry, and the things that make us most angry are the most strident, certain statements about other things. If you actually talk to another human being, you'll be confronted with the fact that they are a human being just like you, and they flip-flop, and they're not they have doubt sometimes too. And so I think that we can any conversation. I'm not interested in any conversation with someone who is just going to lecture me and tell me, like, from whom I can learn nothing from, or that that can't even admit the possibility that they might have something to learn from me. And the same goes the other way around. And so yeah, I guess I'm truly, I think low anthropology dismantles the culture of warring certainties that threatens to take all of us captive and make us hate each other, because that's what it does. It makes us hate each other. And low anthropology again brings in light and love.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Boy, that almost that ties to in the garden with Eve, the serpent with the temptation, and with the tree of knowledge was really the lie of defining our own good and evil. We define what's good and bad, not going off of what God objectively says what's good and bad. It's that goes back to the garden. I mean, us as mankind trying to define terms on ourselves, right?
Yeah, 100%. So what is the, so I'm interested, again, for the sake of this book, just being a person in the world, just like you guys, like this like discourse that we live in is kind of painful, and it causes breakdown of relationships and love and families, and within families, and between, teammates and things like that. And like, how do you, what's the bridge? What's the way back?
Yeah.
Is it
we live in an us versus them culture.
We live in an us versus them culture, and like a culture of low anthropology doesn't have much space for that. If there's anything certain, it's that there's no certainty. Like that's the, or at least that you do not have full access to it. So I just want to say that it's like I want to find common ground with fellow believers, with non-believers, and I just think that we're mistaken when we think we find that. It's not through our shared values. It's through our distance from our whatever values we hold. That's where I can start to love a person who has a completely atheistic take on the world, that's high anthropology, et cetera, et cetera. I can find I can be in the same room with them if they're at least willing to admit that they can act like a hypocrite too sometimes. Like, then I'll be like, oh, well, okay, you're a human being too. Because you know what? I have these Christian convictions and I don't live up to them. That's why I need grace. And that's why I need God. And maybe you've got these, completely materialistic, imminent frame kind of, or kind of self-realization type things. But if you can, the moment you admit to me that you too struggle with living up to these ideals you've chosen perfectly, well, then we can actually sort of talk, and I can say, oh, well, maybe we both just we're dealing with different sorts of things, and maybe we can now talk about the different things we're trying to live up to, without the pretense that either of us are doing it perfectly. I mean, that's yeah. Such a weight off, and it opens up space, and it opens up curiosity, and it opens up freedom, and the things that we lack.
That's good.
Since we're a Christian podcast, to cap it off at the end of this episode, I just want to zero in on the chapter on religion, low anthropology and religion. So how does low anthropology better explain us as religious people, and especially so in our understanding of the law and gospel?
Yeah, I think well, yeah, a low anthropology understands the distinction between the law and the gospel, and takes it as very, very important in the life of a believer. High anthropology tends to mix the two in ways that can be very confusing. And what I mean by that is a low anthropology states that this side of heaven, I will never look like a person. I will never look fully like Jesus. I will always look like a person who needs Jesus. I will never get to the place where I need God's grace any less. And in a sense, I will never get to a place where the law will not convict me of sin. High anthropology, people have different ideas about the uses of the law, and a high anthropology may not say it outright, but it tends to make the law into something you can fulfill. Once you become a Christian through the Holy Spirit, it becomes a sort of the third use of the law. And I'm not. I mean, I'm a sort of a Lutheran in the sense I don't really sign on to the third use of the law, but I know that a lot of Christians do, and there's a biblical basis for that, as there is for my own position. But I would say that the third use cannot ever become primary because it plays too directly to our desire to control and to no longer need God. And it if it's there, then it is as a gentle sort of roadmap. But knowing what low anthropology says, that my propensity, even after salvation, is so strong toward usurping the reins from God, and trying to make turning Christianity into self-improvement. Sorry, someone is trying to sign on to my account. That I forgot what I was going to say. That it's very important to
the self-improvement project of a Christian with the law.
With the self-improvement project of the Christian with the law, a low anthropology says the law is there to remind me of my need for God and my need for bring me to my knees, and the gospel is there to acquit me, to absolve me, for the forgiveness, to wash me clean in the blood of the Lamb, and that needs to remain primary. And when that gets muddied, you get into an amplified view of sort of like, once you're a Christian, well, then you can become a little bit more. You may not become fully like Jesus, but you become a little more like Jesus, and that sounds great. And you don't want to deny that, because I've seen Christians who are sort of more Christ-like. But once that becomes stated outright and becomes the goal of the Christian life, well, then all of a sudden that takes over. That takes over, and you lose sight of things, and you have Christian burnout, which is usually some form of confusion of the law and the gospel.
That speaks volumes to both of us, and me doing the confession of sin and absolving for the congregation and taking it myself, and Nick hearing it. I'm sure you hearing it too. And I hear this too. Well, people, and and some people, like you said, you hear it and you see it in their lives. They're like, yeah, this is me before Christ and after Christ. And they're like, it is just a stark contrast in their life. And like, yeah, I can definitely see that Christ has done some pretty crazy stuff in your life. But the second that becomes like the standard, like, hey, if your life hasn't changed like this after Christ has saved you, then I don't know about your Christian faith and how you've been walking with Christ. Versus saying like, no, the Christian faith is not your perfectibility into Christ. It's that he has saved you despite yourself, what Romans 5 says, like in the midst of your sin, he saved you. Not that you'll become more like him. That's not the gospel that he saved you. Not that you'll become more like him, which I think those tend to get confused so often, which I like your chapter on that, because it talks about this. And that was my
thank you.
I hope Christian life.
No, I've heard that chapter really speaks loudly, and some people wanted the whole book to be that chapter, and I think it's a very important chapter. I hope I named a dynamic of what I would call selectively high anthropology, or the way that Christians tend to slowly inflate our anthropology until we forget why we became a Christian in the first place.
Yep.
And we've sort of start to believe that we are partnering meaningfully with God in the redemption of the world, when in fact, again, the Christian life is a journey into deeper dependence. It's not a journey towards finding yourself, it's a journey towards losing yourself. And I think that's freedom, and that's beauty, and that's a wonderful continual journey of life. And it's an invitation to relationship, and it's an invitation to all these things, rather than making Christianity into another ladder to climb. Which is such the temptation for people with a low anthropology, who are addicted to control and even know that they shouldn't do this, but continue to do it. So I hope that I find that it's important to keep the distinction between the law and the gospel pretty paramount
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
in the life of a believer. And that's one of the reasons why I'm in a liturgical church.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily because I'm in love with the 16th century or something like that. It's or the 19th century, whatever, or
Yeah.
England.
Yeah.
It's because I think that they such as the liturgy, that it invites a person into confession weekly and assures us of absolution every single week, and then invites us to go out into the world to do the works that God has prepared in advance for you to do. And life just becomes a big surprise party. I think it's a beautiful world. And also, by the way, let me say this last thing about low anthropology. It does not, cynicism is different from low anthropology. Cynicism is a certainty, again, about yourself and the world. Low anthropology leaves you open to not knowing and to the surprise of grace and the possibility of love and all the wonderful things that happen in the world despite ourselves. And so a outlook of low anthropology actually sets you up for awe and wonder at the fact that despite what I'm like and what other people have been like toward me, God is at work and doing amazing things with alarming regularity. And isn't that incredible? Let's highlight them. Let's talk about them. Let's try to sort of put ourselves, get a little, I want to be over there where I see God at work. Like that sounds, what a cool thing to hitch a ride on that train. So that's where I leave it usually.
A correct creator creature distinction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which doesn't mean, by the way, we're not creative.
Yeah.
Right.
But it means that we're simply not
The creator.
The creator. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We know our place. We know who we are and who we aren't, and who God is.
Yeah. But in a world that sort of venerates entrepreneurs and sort of founders and people who are kind of elevating the discourse, like it's very hard to keep in mind. It doesn't seem like a worthy cause all the time.
Yeah.
But it's the only roadway to love.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great kind of ending for this. And maybe if you want to point our listeners to places where they can find you. I know you talk about Mockingbird, where they can find you on Mockingbird, and where some of their stuff is found, and where they can find more of your writing, and if you have anything coming up too.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Peter. Well, Mockingbird has a conference in Orlando at the end of January. I'll be in Austin, Texas at the end of February. Then we have a big New York conference at the end of April. mbird.com is our website. The Mockingcast is the podcast I host with a couple of folks, and that's anywhere podcasts are found. But the best thing people can do, honestly, if they like the book or one of these books, is rate it or review it, frankly, on Goodreads or Amazon.
Yep.
That's how these these algorithms tend to sort of work. So, I know it's a hassle to do that, but if the books resonate, that's the way to help more people find them.
Yeah, one of my aunts, or one of my wife's aunts, saw the book she came over last night because we live next to my wife's whole family. She came over and saw the book on our coffee table. I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's like, oh, I want to read this book. So I gave her the book because she's gonna buy the book, and now she's gonna go read the book. But
praise God. That's so great. That's the best thing I hear, guys, is people are like, I want to give this book to everyone I know, and I'm not afraid to give it to so and so, and yet I also know that it ends. I mean, I'm clear about my Christianity.
Oh yeah, you are
from the
at the
outset.
end. You're very clear. Oh yeah,
and I use it's not. I don't use maybe the requisite number of scriptural references per chapter that some people would like, but I
appreciate that. You kind of, it's like a slow on ramp, and then it's like a pow right at the end. Like here it is.
Thanks. That's by design, and that's how I've experienced the gospel most readily. Usually, is through some sort of 90% law description kind of bondage, and then all of a sudden, at the very last moment, it's like, but bam, eucatastrophe, snatched from the jaws of defeat. There is hope, there is love, there is light, there is goodness, there's beauty, there's truth, and there is ultimately God.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, David Zahl, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for this book and your ministry. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, guys. Great to meet you.